As we continue our study of Exodus chapters 1 through 18, we're turning now to the historical context. There are three topics that we'd like to treat here. One has to do with the question of the historicity of the actual event of the Exodus, not the book title, but the actual movement of these peoples. Second is dating options of the movement of these peoples, the Exodus event. Third, the route they may have taken. And finally, the concept of the plagues and how these would have appeared in the eyes and experience of inhabitants of Egypt at that time. First, then, the historicity of the Exodus event. On the one hand, there are some in modern scholarship, such as John Van Seters, who would respond that the quest for the historical Moses, that is, the efforts to try and discern to what degree did the figure of Moses actually exist, that these sort of efforts are futile, and that Moses as an individual is only a legend. So a later construction, a fictitious construction to try and create a sense of identity for a people created much, much later than the time he's purported to have lived. And this would extend not only to the figure of Moses, but events surrounding the Exodus as well. Others, such as James Hoffmeyer, epitomized in his book Israel in Egypt, which I find a very, very useful volume. Another modern scholar responds by saying, on the contrary, not only is there a high likelihood that Moses himself existed, but the events of the Exodus, there are telltale signs within the account which tell us that whoever wrote this was in close contact with Egypt of that era. One feature, for example, traces to the name given to the child Moses. Now, certainly we have the biblical etymology, which connects it to a Hebrew verb meaning to draw out. So consequently, Moses is explained as the child who was drawn out of the waters. That itself is a powerful rescue motif. Think of the ark, which was drawn out of the waters, or at least survived by floating above the chaotic waters of the flood. But we're interested here not in motifs, but rather in the language. Draw out traces to the meaning given in Scripture for the Hebrew. It's interesting to note also, however, that Mose, those components of consonant, have the idea of giving birth from the verb mesi. We find them in the name Achmose. You're acquainted with Ramses. That's the combination of the Egyptian sun god Ra plus Meses, which has the idea of birth. So, born of or born to Ra, an indication of the attribution of deity for Ramses. Thutmose would be another example, combination of the god Thot plus Meses, to be born. What would this suggest? This would suggest that in addition to the biblical etymology of his name, his adoptive mother, a daughter of Pharaoh, may have given him a name which had meaning not only in Hebrew, but in Egyptian as well. I don't know, but what you may have had an opportunity to meet people who are giving a name to a child and their own ethnic background, their own citizenship may be outside the citizenship of or the nation in which they are living at the time of bringing the child and giving birth to the child. Sometimes what they will do is seek a name which operates both in English and in the language of their own nation. That may have been what Moses' adoptive mother was doing. If so, a very, very clever, very strategic ploy. Hoffmeyer also points out, in terms of words, that terms we encounter in the Hebrew Bible, terms for basket, bulrushes, pitch, reeds, and the term for the river's edge, all of these are either Egyptian terms, as preserved in Hebrew, or at least their cognates for a Semitic equivalent. Fascinating sense of immersion of this story within the Egyptian environment. might be interested to know what part of the Nile looks like. This was taken on a trip that my wife and I were privileged to enjoy, study trip, and also visiting some family members in Cairo. This is the Nile in the Cairo region. It was June, I believe, when we took this picture. And at that time, it was a gently flowing river. It was not at all a raging torrent, easy to operate boats on with a high degree of safety. Another view of the River Nile. One of the reasons for taking this picture was to show that in modern times, and consequently back then, there was significant vegetation alongside parts of the riverbank. Can you imagine a basket with a young infant being secreted there within those reeds? A very clever hiding place among vegetation of this sort, still visible along parts of the Nile. Now, as to historicity, we take up the topic of Moses being of foreign origin, nevertheless at home in Pharaoh's court, growing up in that court. Here's something you may not be aware of. There is evidence that in the court of Thutmose III, we know of foreign children who were welcomed to the court and given training there in the 15th century. These foreign children would have been from the territory of Moses' ethnic origin, that is, from the Syro-Palestine territory. Incidentally, this was not just generosity or taking care of orphans. No, it was very strategic on Thutmose's part. He was training children of neighboring nations so that they would be at home with Egyptian customs, and this would strengthen relationship with those chieftain children. These were royal children, bureaucratically, or in terms of royal households. They were advanced children in their own society. Consequently, the notion of a non-Egyptian child such as Moses growing up in Pharaoh's court, that's not totally unreasonable. Going to turn our attention now to the historic topics of the commodity of grain and the construction of brick storage facilities. We'll begin by showing you in a moment a wall painting of grain, but I want to give you the location of it. This is the Hatshepsut Mortuary Temple. It's located upstream Nile, about halfway down the length of the Nile within Egypt. It's located opposite Thebes, and that is to say opposite the Karnak and Luxor temple complex. In fact, where we're standing, we are facing due west. The Nile is behind us about perhaps 1 mile. We are on the west bank. On the east bank, the sunrise side of the Nile, right along here, is the temple complex of Karnak. In fact, from Karnak, you can look directly across and see this. It's strategically located directly opposite Karnak. The hills that you see rising up behind the Hatshepsut Mortuary Temple. Incidentally, Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh. Beyond these hills, and a little bit to the left, would be the Valley of the Kings, famous for the burial sites of numerous pharaohs. Next shot, we're going to go inside this mortuary temple. Notice this painting. This represents a mound of grain, and the worker, in fact, there's more than one worker, isn't there? On the right, they are scooping up this grain. So this is representing either delivery of grain, harvest of grain, storage of grain, something processing large quantities of grain. We are told in Exodus 1 that the Pharaoh employed the forced labor, the slave labor of the Israelites to build various buildings, including storage facilities. We're not suggesting that the Hatshepsut Mortuary Temple was built by Israelites. That's not the point. This is simply a graphic presentation that attention to storage of things like grain, accumulation of grain, is something that we find right there in the artistic records. And now we're remaining in the territory of the Valley of the Kings. They're opposite Thebes, the Karnak-Luxor temple complex. We are in effect a little farther away from the Nile, up over that ridge of hills that was by the Hatshepsut mortuary temple. We're now coming to another mortuary temple, one dedicated to Ramses. Here we're interested in the building materials. Notice the bricks, not bricks. Notice the blocks, stone blocks. You can see them in sections, discs, making their way up this beautiful column. You can see a sectioned stone block here. The way they would build these, incidentally, is rough discs of stone, rather large one, stacked one on top of the other, and then gradually shaped down into smooth vertical columnar surfaces. Here you see more of the stone pillars, the columns. And now notice the brown brick structure that's encased with the cyan ring there in the distance. We're still at the Ramesseum, near the Valley of the Kings. Let's close in on that. Notice now the building materials. Clearly these are not stone, but rather sun-baked bricks. We're told that the Israelites were employed making bricks, and in part that was for building storage cities. Now those storage cities would have been far north of this territory, so we're not suggesting that these buildings are the remnant of Israelite enslavement, slave labor. We're simply noticing in Egypt extant brick structures that seem to serve a storage purpose. And now let's turn to the historical topic relative to the dating of the Exodus event. Roughly when would this have taken place? Scholarship rests on three possibilities, early, middle, and late, and let's briefly treat these. The early date would place the Exodus event at about 1446. And you may wonder, well, how did they reach that date? Here's how. It's by taking very literally the statement in 1 Kings 6:1. And you're thinking to yourself, there's no record of the Exodus in 1 Kings. You're right. That's much, much later. It's the monarchy. But what we do have is the record of the completion of Solomon's temple and the statement that this happened 480 years after the Exodus. So by locating the monarchy of Solomon, roughly 950 BC, then we backdate 480, and we wind up with a scholar's suggestion that would locate us at 1446. That's the early date possibility. Let's go next to the late date, and then we'll end with the middle. The reasoning on the late date goes like this. They propose 1150 as the approximate date for the Exodus, based on discovery at Jericho of a destruction layer. The destruction layer would give witness to the conquest. And they say archaeologists find a destruction layer which allows them then to backdate the Exodus to 1150 to account for the conquest corresponding to or coinciding with the destruction layer that they find in Jericho. The third option, one that I find a little more persuasive, more likely, is the middle date, 1250 BC. This one pays most attention, gives highest credence to the reference of Israel being put in the employ of the Pharaoh, slave labor, for building these Ramses cities in the delta, the Nile Delta area. So that would make us look to the Egyptian chronology of pharaohs, locate a pharaoh who was interested in building those cities, and that puts us onto Ramses II. We know that he ruled in this time frame of 1250. That would put the Exodus at 1250. This slide recaps that same observation, saying that in Ramses II's reign, which did span from 1279 to 1213, We know that he was heavily involved in building projects. Let's take a look at some of those. You'll see some of the monumental projects that he instigated. Now we're back at Luxor, down south along the Nile. That figure represents Ramses. We've already looked at the Ramesseum. Not every pharaoh had so magnificent a mortuary temple. He had people employed building this for him. In case you're curious, how does a mortuary temple function? We've seen one of Hatshepsut as well, haven't we? Here is just a thumbnail sketch of what led to these. The understanding in the Egyptian theology was that the pharaohs would persist in life after death. They would survive death in an altered state. In order for that condition to be enjoyable for them, there had to be tasks and particularly meals and various ceremonies performed, meals supplied and ceremonies performed. You need a place for that to happen. You need personnel to carry those out. The personnel will be mortuary priests. The place where this will take place will be your mortuary temple. So you build such a temple, you fund the priests with the instructions for them to carry out the ceremonies after your death so that you may continue in a strong and prosperous life after death. You might wonder, well, is that simply for the comfort of the pharaoh? Now, here's a little more of the theology that gave credence to validity or made it seem worthwhile for this enterprise to continue. It was thought that when the pharaoh was in the afterlife, then he would be able to perform deeds on behalf of the Egyptian nation. So they wanted him to have a good afterlife. We're continuing with these insights into the grandeur of Ramses II. We're still at the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple. Look at the beauty of these columns supporting that roof. The pigment in these paints is original. They are doing some retouching of it, but here we're looking at the more faded ones, and I expect these are original pigments. What's fascinating to me about the Egyptian architecture is the blending of writing and shape. Even in the lintels, some of these high beams atop the columns, you see messages, hieroglyphic messages, either identifying individuals. The circular ones, you may be aware, are cartouches. These have names of figures, of pharaohs. This one in particular, I can see, has the hieroglyphics for Ramses. We'll see one of those later. The three-branched figure here, and then the folded piece here. Monumental architecture from Ramses II, part of his labor in other locations within Egypt, not down here in the Ramesseum, but other locations, was supplied by slave labor from the Israelites. Here again you see a close-up, the cartouche for one of the cartouches for Ramses. This, as I recall, represents one of the goddesses. It just gives you a sense of how massive were the buildings and the messages portrayed there. Here we see again the Ramses cartouche. Another portrayal of Ramses as a powerful military figure in his chariot, led by his steeds, with bow ready to fling an arrow into some enemy. Let's look a little more closely at this sort of portrayal. In particular, notice the wagon wheel, the chariot wheel, and especially notice what's inside the green shaded zone. Take a moment to study that. If we zoom in on this, you'll notice two figures. Here's a head, an arm, another head, and an arm. The message conveyed by this artistic portrayal is the might of Ramses II, able with bow and arrow and chariot wheel to subdue anyone who gets in his way. We're indicating this is the Pharaoh, that it's very likely that it was up against this Pharaoh that God sent Moses to say, "Let my people go." It's not surprising that Moses initially responded with reluctance. Here is a monumental statue in honor of the Pharaoh. And now back across the river at Karnak, we'll encounter more of Ramses. Among those pillars in the hypostyle hall, we find the cartouche of Ramses. At Luxor, the adjacent temple complex, we also find Ramses. You get the impression that this individual worked very hard to paint himself large in the architecture of his nation. Incidentally, the kings that we're interested in surrounding the events of the Exodus can be identified in the Valley of the Kings as to their burial places. This is what it looks like, a very barren territory. We had the opportunity of entering the tomb of Merneptah. He will be one of three figures that play largely in the story of the Exodus. This portrays the Valley of the King's tomb from Merneptah. The entry would be up here on the higher level in the upper right. Then you move down a corridor. There's a space about midway. And then finally the resting place of the sarcophagus would be there in the larger open area supported with beams and anterooms. Here's the entryway. In a moment we'll show a close-up of the artwork over the gateway. As I recall, this deity is Khnum, and you see a scarab beetle surrounded by the sun disk. The Ramses, or the pharaohs, that we're interested in here particularly are Seti I, and before him Ramses I, who we understand would have been the pharaohs who instigated the oppression of the Israelites, that is, declaring that the sons must be killed and setting up the enslavement. Ramses II would be in the position then of the one whom Moses encountered, and his son, by the way, these are father, son, grandson. Ramses II's son Merneptah would be the pharaoh during the post-Exodus era, during Joshua's era, for example. And finally, we'll track the story of Ramses to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This beautiful, beautiful museum in downtown Cairo is built of red rock, red granite, as I recall, installed by the French, and just certainly an incredible collection of world treasures. One of the rooms within the Cairo Museum, a particular temperature-controlled, a climate-controlled room, has the remains of several royal figures, among them Ramses II. It's intriguing to think that when alive, this figure may have been the one who uttered the words, "I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." But later, after suffering personal loss, he changed his mind. Here then is a summary suggesting that if we follow the middle dating option of around 1250, Seti I would have been the pharaoh of the oppression, possibly Ramses I even before him. Then Merneptah, son of Ramses II, would be the pharaoh during Israel's settlement of Canaan during the period of Joshua. And Ramses II, in between the two of those, the pharaoh encountered by Moses. And now we'll focus on a stela, that is a large stone monument erected by Merneptah, that has a fascinating story to tell. It's dated at 1207 BC. Here's the appearance of it. We don't have a scale piece alongside, but notice that it's 2.3 meters tall, something in the range of perhaps 7 or 8 feet tall. It's a massive, massive piece. I suppose it's about 3 to 4 feet wide, and the thickness of it is remarkable too. It's probably about 7 or 8 inches thick. So this is just a gigantic, smooth stone slab. It's interesting to note that Merneptah, Pharaoh Merneptah, in the 13th century was not the first to use this piece of stone. It's actually got a message from one of his ancestors that was incised on the first side, what now would be the back, and Merneptah, in a sense, recycled it and put a record of his own on the front. This is a record of exploits. What a powerful king he was, people that he was able to subdue. We're interested in particular at the hieroglyphs that are going to appear where the cyan ring is towards the bottom. We'll close in on those hieroglyphs in a just a sketch representation. The actual stone monument does not have this tan papyrus-looking effect. This is simply a picture that gives us a sense of the location of those glyphs that we'll see more clearly on the next. Incidentally, if you have occasion to visit Egypt and can go to the Cairo Museum, at least when I visited the museum a number of years ago, it was located in the first entry area towards the back on the right. It was not easy to locate, but it's definitely worth finding. Here are those hieroglyphs again. This particular group, keep in mind this is a record of exploits, and we're going to encounter a name of a people group that Merneptah tells he has squashed in his forays out of Egypt and up into Syro-Palestine. Here's how it reads. This pair of, these are actual reeds. They look like feathers, but they represent scribes' reeds. The double reed indicates something like the letter Y. This lateral piece is like a rope with a knot in it, produces the sound S. These are lips of the mouth that produces the sound R. A single reed, I. The griffin vulture, can you see the beak up to the upper right and then the body going down lateral diagonal and two legs coming off of it? That's the griffin vulture. It produces the sound Ah, comparable to Aleph in Hebrew. And then a second R. Stringing this together, reading from right to left, Yisre'ar. And then if we realize that Egypt has no L, that is, the R glyph will substitute for L in other languages. If we convert the last one to the L sound, then we have Israel. So we have the name Israel, but it's not simply an individual. It's not saying we conquered one strong little fellow whose name was Israel somewhere in Syro-Palestine. Rather, these last two characters at the end, which are two seated human figures. You see the arms jutting out from the first one, both arms out, the head, the torso, and then seated with the legs sticking up, the knees sticking up. And this is another figure with that similar shape, slightly different figure. When we encounter this with the plurality sign, the three strokes means that this is a group, indicating a group, not an individual or a single commodity. That's the Egyptians' way of saying the name that you just read, Yisrael, was a people group. So they had the stature, they were numerous enough to qualify as a people group. This is the first extra-biblical literary record of Israel as a people group. It dates to 1207 BC, and it was Merneptah the Pharaoh who said, I harassed or oppressed or squashed these people. We know they survived, whatever was this skirmish or encounter. But he encountered them, felt he had had a victorious day, and chronicled it. And as a result, we know that that people group dates at least to 1207. Very significant archaeological artifact in the Cairo Museum. Here's a feature that may interest you, having to do with how Egyptians tended to write history. When they encountered or overcame a particular individual, the policy was if you were trained as an Egyptian historiographer and you were writing down some vanquished foe, chronicling that, when it came to the victim's name, an individual's name, they would tend not to record the name. I suppose they might have recorded the people group, but they wouldn't record the name of the individual. And the understanding is that they were proving the insignificance of that individual, what a poor person, or what shall we say, how great was their victory, the Egyptian victory, and how insignificant was the foe, so significant that we won't even give them the honor of preserving their name. And so we have nameless victims according to Egyptian historiography. We're observing that in the Exodus account, the name of the Pharaoh is not given to us. We're given his rank, he's Pharaoh. By the way, that itself is an Egyptian term. It means the big house, referring to the palace complex where their monarch would live. We do not know, except by extrapolation in comparison to Egyptian king lists, we don't know who this Pharaoh most likely was. The name is withheld. This is the way one trained in Egyptian historiography would have tended to have written that account. And we're thinking of a people who grew up in Egypt, the Israelites. And we're thinking of Moses, who was trained in the literature and language of Egypt. Very interesting, isn't it? And you may be wondering, well, didn't everyone in the Middle East have that same convention of not naming their victims? No. In fact, there were other empires which routinely gave you the names of their victims, and that would be the case for the Mesopotamian cultures. Assyrians, when they were writing histories, they would write down for our benefit the names of their victims. So just one more point where Exodus matches the style we would expect coming from someone who was immersed in the Egyptian culture. Let's turn now to the possible routes traveled by the Israelites coming out of Egypt. There are two possibilities to be aware of. One is the northern route. Here you see the Mediterranean, the Suez area, and then the Nile would be running off to our left, off the scene. The northern route proposes that along this dotted line, where you see now the cyan line, they may have traveled the dotted line, crossing water then along this sort of isthmus, this peninsula, proposing that this water encompassed by some of this shoreline would have been the Reed Sea, the Red Sea in Hebrew, the Reed Sea as it's known. To me, this proposal is a bit problematic because, at least within the text itself, we understand that God stipulated Israel was not to go by this way along the sea, lest they encounter hostility and lose heart and then easily turn back. So for that reason, it seems this is not a likely option, but you want to be aware of it. There's also the possibility of a southern route. And here you see a map portraying that. We see the Sinai Peninsula here, the Suez area underneath the numeral 4. You see the Nile portrayed with a few lines here on the far left. So the southern route would have been from numerals 1 to 2, working along that fashion. This portrayal, this map is taken from James Hoffmeier's book, Israel in Egypt. He has done extensive study, among other things, to search out possibilities for the route. Here are some of the features that we want to be aware of from his studies. First, in ancient times, the Egyptians established a water barrier, a defensive canal, along this territory. It reached to the Mediterranean. Its inception was in Lake Timsah. So we have an excavation, or rather a canal building project resulting in a defensive fortress canal. There were fortresses, actual fortresses at various points along here to deter marauders who would tend to come in through this way. Egypt was protecting themselves. There are a couple of cities named in the Exodus account in 1:11, Ramses and Pithom. It's highly likely that those correspond respectively to the cities of Kantir and Tel El Rotabeh, cities or excavation sites. And next, consider this site. In Exodus 14, we understand that Israel was made their way to Pi Hahirot. As scholars try to ascertain what this location was, a strong case, according to Hofmeyr, can be made etymologically as follows. Pi-Hahirot, rather than being an Egyptian name, may likely be a Semitic name, and that would mean the mouth, Pi, Ha, the definite article the, Hirot, canal. Now you see why it was important to appreciate that Egypt had developed this defensive canal within its inception point at Lake Timsah, a mouth, as it were, of the canal, starting here out of Timsah, leading to the Mediterranean. So this may well be the location identified in Exodus 14. What took place at Pi-Hahirot is that this is where Israel was encamped before crossing the Red Sea. The Egyptians were pressing down on them from the back, and then God opens the way before them across the water. And so it's proposed by Hofmeyr that a possible Exodus route, the southern route, would have followed from Pi-Ramses, Kantir, then along through Pi-Hahirot, through the water at Lake Timsah, and beyond the Bitter Lakes. The traditional Red Sea, you see the top, the northern portion of it, down the lower part. So this could have been perceived as part of the Red Sea complex or series of waterways. Another aspect worth being aware of has to do with the plagues and how that would have taken place and been understood in ancient Egypt. A scholar by the name of Greta Hort has made the effort to try and see, could these have been a cascade of natural events? So, for example, initially, the water turning to blood, she suggests that this may have been the result of a particular Nile condition which allowed a flagellate, a red flagellate, to multiply with numerous quantities, giving the water a red hue, causing in turn fish to die, and then out of this various other plagues would have resulted, including the insects and the frogs and things cascading one after another. Nahum Sarna responds to that saying, well, perhaps some of these were naturalistic, but it rather seems to him that God is definitely harnessing nature. It's not simply or strictly naturalistic, but there is a supernatural element as God harnesses parts of nature. Although he cautions us when we reach plague number 10, which is the death of the firstborn, this is entirely supernatural. And we want to be aware that even if there was some element of nature cascading involved, this explanation would not explain how it is that Moses is able to predict and determine the onset and conclusion of so many of those elements. So while Greta Hort's naturalistic cascade is intriguing, and it's a fascinating study, there are some parts of the account that it simply will not explain. Finally, concerning the plagues, I found it helpful to observe, as some have indicated, that two plagues in particular may have been much more ominous in the experience of the Egyptians than we as moderns would have thought. Namely, the thunderstorm or hail, plague number 7, and secondly, the darkness, number 9, may have been especially threatening, convincing. Interesting, isn't it, that the darkness is the next to the last one? You may ask, well, why would darkness at noonday, at broad daylight, why would this have been so ominous? Think, for instance, if one of the deities that you think is supreme is Ra. In fact, the reigning pharaoh is named for the sun god Ra. And then along appears another deity who is able to, in effect, turn the lights off, who is able to cancel and nullify the very emblem of Ra's power, the sun. Clearly, this other deity is superior to your reigning deity. We'll conclude this study of Exodus 1 through 18 with the next video focusing on theological implications.